Good morning to you. As you can see, I'm in the warmth of my study this morning. My upload today is a little bit later than normal. Sometimes I feel that the Lord is saying, "Come ye apart and rest a while." And I just felt that perhaps today I needed to come ye apart a little bit. I normally prepare my messages in the morning to give in the morning. And this one I prepared last night. And sometimes I think that it's important, isn't it, that we just take a break occasionally and just let the Lord recharge us. So there will be times, I think, possibly where you might not see me every day, but I will be back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger said. And as long as the channel keeps going, as long as I'm not thrown off at any point, then you'll see me. I'm going to possibly look into getting some backup channels as well on here, knowing what YouTube is like with their sensitivities and all that sort of thing. So anyway, today's message is this. I've called it the race to the bottom. The devil is just getting warmed up. The race to the bottom. The devil is just getting warmed up. Some years ago, I watched a movie with Al Pacino. Some of you might have known it. It was called Scent of a Woman. And it's quite a heartwarming story of an older man, a blind man, who takes on a young charge for the weekend. He needed somebody to take him to New York City and give him a good time for the weekend. He wanted to kill himself, actually. And he wanted to have two good days, and he needed somebody to escort him to New York. But he didn't know that this young man actually has a terrible problem. He was given a scholarship to a very prestigious school, and an incident occurred with some young men where he was accused of doing something that he didn't do. And the upshot of the story is that Al Pacino goes and defends him before the whole school in a kind of a tribunal. And he starts to defend this young man and to say no, that he didn't do it, and he spent the whole weekend with him and he was having a really great time, and he's a very great young man and he's full of integrity. And the headmaster who was chairing this tribunal tried to shut Al Pacino up, and he said to him, look, I think that's enough from you. And Al Pacino's response was, "I'm only just getting warmed up." And I thought, yes, there's so much behind that. There's so much more that has to be said. In the film, it was in defense of this young man, and in the end, it was a good story because the young man was vindicated. And so it is. We put up a spirited defense, don't we, very often? And I think it's important to do that, and especially if it's to do with defending our faith and standing for the Word of God. And again, I'm looking at the theme of Antichrist and the end times. And of course, today I was struck particularly because of the events in the Pacific Ocean with what's happening in Tonga. And I was reading the article this morning where it said that it's very unusual. Those were the words used. It was very unusual, and it hadn't happened in an awfully long time, that the whole Pacific basin had become affected by a tsunami. Apparently it's been felt from Alaska to Australia, and the explosion was heard. And of course Jesus warns of these things, doesn't he, in Matthew 24. And I'm going to be looking a little bit at Matthew 24 this morning. And I was thinking about that term, race to the bottom. And as we know, we've seen many antichrists through the ages, and especially in the 20th century. We know we've seen them through history, haven't we? And I'm just thinking of the particular ones in the 20th century. There's Pol Pot and Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, and Chairman Mao Zedong, of course today even the modern leader of China. But now we're starting to see a trickle-down effect. Something is happening where not just those kind of men are becoming what we might call antichrists, but we're starting to see it in Western leaders. From New Zealand to Australia to Canada to the United States. It's as though blanket of evil has come upon the minds of Western leaders, and they're starting to turn. Even our Boris Johnson here, and I've spoken about him before, legions of demons have been released. Satan, as I said the other day in the other church in Rentham, that Satan's mustering his forces, and he's doing it everywhere. And it's as though he's in a real hurry to complete his work. He knows the end from the beginning too. He knows that his end is near. But he's in a hurry to take as many people with him as possible. And this global mindset, we see it, as I've said, in Western leaders, and we're starting to see this trickle-down effect from leaders to, as we see in America particularly, governors of states, mayors, and then it started to affect councils, and then, of course, as we see in education with teachers and the way that schools are behaving with regard to restrictions and things like that. And so this is a mindset, a global mindset, and it's a mindset of acceptance, isn't it? I said the other day that compliance means silence. Compliance and silence go together. But it's time that the church found its voice. It's time that we as Christians started to speak up. And so we see this top-down thing taking place. And we see it too, don't we, in employers, the way that they're being encouraged to mandate the procedure. And so everybody is becoming like almost like these many antichrists. The spirit of Antichrist is sweeping the earth like a tsunami. And it's coming upon us. And the worst of all is then it goes down from employers, it goes to colleagues, people who work with us, and neighbours, people that know us. And then down again, down to friends, people that have stood with us for years, that now maybe there's division amongst friends, particularly with you know what here. And worst of all, family. Once that starts to take in, then we really know that we've reached the time Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. I'd like to just share some of those words with you in Matthew 24. And let's just go down here from 1 to 6. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, here comes the great prophecy. There shall not be left one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. And as I've just said about the spirits of Antichrist, they're all around us now. They're circling, and they're circling for their prey. For many shall come in my name, as we said earlier on, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Isn't that interesting? That Jesus said, See ye be not troubled. Yes, we talk about these things all the time. We almost are encouraged to, by the world particularly, to fear, particularly the medical procedures and the this and that are used to mitigate this so-called virus. And fear is permeating the world, the spirit of fear. And governments have used fear, haven't they, over the last 2 years to coerce people into following the restrictions. You know, the one where you have to cover your mouth like that, where you cover your mouth, and that other restriction where you can't walk next to somebody in case you give them a germ. And so fear has gripped the hearts of men. But Jesus says here quite clearly, See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass. They must. We can pray for a respite. We can pray for a time when, yes, it's easier. And for us in the UK at the moment, it is a bit easier, I suppose, with all the scandals that are happening with Boris Johnson. people's attention has been a bit diverted. And because of that diversion, it's given us an opportunity to say, well, if he can't obey the laws, why should we? So there is a little bit of a spirit of that here, but I can see across the whole of Europe, across the EU, across Canada and Australia and New Zealand, that isn't the case. I hear of people being forcibly removed from their homes and taken to camps in Australia. And in Lithuania, I believe that you can't literally do anything unless you've got the pass, the one I mean. So it is getting harder and harder, more difficult, isn't it, all the time? But as Jesus said, these things must happen. So we must expect them. We can't get away from the prophecy of our Lord. He knows. Verse 9. I'd like to pick up on verse 9 particularly here. Just before that, actually, yes. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes, right? We could insert there tsunamis as well, couldn't we? In diverse places. At the moment, these things often happen in places where there are least population. But if you remember back 100 years or so in San Francisco, that was a mighty earthquake. And they're still expecting another one. Those of you perhaps who are living near there will know all about the San Andreas fault. And so these times are coming upon us, and as it says here in verse 8, all these things are the beginning of sorrows. Just the beginning of sorrows. So, but let not your heart be troubled. We know that God has us in the palm of his hand, don't we? But verse 9 I wanted to bring up here. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and shall be hated. You shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. So what do we face now? We face affliction, we face death, and we face hate. And Jesus just puts it all in one sentence. We don't know quite how it would have been come across to the disciples. It maybe would have been one enormous shock. That if somebody says to you, you're going to be killed, you're going to be taken captive, you're going to be hated, you're going to be persecuted, that has a natural human reaction. Something happens inside us when we hear that. But yet we hear many gospels, don't we? We hear many gospels. And we have the gospel of the movement that says great revivals are coming on the earth. Beware the great harvest of 1 billion souls. We see this all over the place. The churches I'm talking about. Just put in $100 in the pot. Pass the pot along. Let's see it multiply. I once was in a Christian camp. I was in the United States. I was staying on a camp in Virginia. I may or may not have told this story before. And the man was preaching the gospel. And at the end of it, at this camp, he said this phrase. He said, "It costs to save the lost." It costs to save the lost. Yes, it does. But he, of course, was only talking in terms of finance, and a massive bucket came around. And in we had to pop our mainly notes, of course. That's what they required. Great revivals are what are the things that are prophesied by many prophets, but not great afflictions. Great revivals. Let's see what Mathew has to say. Let's go to chapter 7 and verse 14. I just want to read this here to you. Jesus said, "Strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." Few there be that find it. Why did he say that? Well, what about the harvest of 1 billion souls? What about half the world coming to Christ? Now, it's for another Bible study, but we could talk about the coming Holocaust on the world in the time of wrath. Here I differentiate, not the time of tribulation, the time of wrath. But there is still also a massive time coming when there will be death and affliction upon the earth like we've never seen before. And Jesus is warning us here. He's not talking about revival. He's talking here about affliction, about death, and about persecution. We're seeing it happen. Things have happened in the last 2 years that haven't happened for a long, long time. In fact, probably in human terms, we've never seen a global move or a mindset changed across the world the way it is now. Let's have a look at verse 10, trying to dissect a little bit of Matthew 24. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Many shall be offended. Offended by what? I've written in my notes here last night, offended by the truth. People will be offended by the truth. People were offended by Jesus Christ. The way, the truth, and the life. Wherever Jesus went, he did two things. Those that followed him, those that had their eyes and their hearts open to him and were healed by him, became his followers and his disciples. But the others, they scorned him, they mocked him, and they were offended by him. What were they offended by? They were offended by his truth. They were offended by who he was. They were offended by his words. And Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. The lies of the Pharisees. And today, the Pharisees are still around, aren't they? They're in growing numbers. As they were in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man. I wrote here in my notes this word. You can't be offended by a silent truth. You can't be offended by a silent truth. In other words, God's given us a voice in these days. We have to speak out the truth. People are going to be offended by us. Yes, but we can't be silent. The time has come for the church to speak out. To be hated by your loved ones is probably the worst of all, I would say. So we see this top-down thing happening, don't we? From leaders of countries, leaders of nations, right down into families. This whole wave of persecution and division. But when it comes to those that we love, that is the hardest of all. Jesus says in verse 13, Matthew 24, he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. There's an endurer. The endurer is required. That's you and me. We have to endure. We know that we'll get the crown of life if we endure and if we stay strong. Another phrase I've written down here. I used to write poetry. Some of you will find that if you go back into my videos, some of my early ones, I actually started this channel really just to quote my poetry. And for the first few videos you'll see that I've written some poetry. I haven't written any lately, but very often I find that with the poetic bent comes I suppose the Lord gives one the ability just to come up with a succinct phrase or something to say that just explains everything. And I've got one here for you this morning. You might like to write it down. It's this. The escapers love their lives, so they don't care to suffer for Jesus. The escapers love their lives. He who will love his life will lose it. He will lose his life for my sake will find it again. I'm going to say something a little hard here, but I'm saying it in the love of the Lord. And I've written this down here. The pre-tribulation mindset is the mindset of a coward, falling short of following Christ. Revelation 21:8, and it reads like this. But for the cowardly, I'll back up to verse 7. He who overcomes shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly, and unbelieving, and abominable, and murderers, and immoral persons, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. The cowardly are lumped together here with murderers and abominable persons. Those that will stand back, and those that will love their lives. Those that won't stand for Christ, because in the end the cowardly turn their backs, and those are the ones that Paul talks about in Thessalonians, those that will fall away. Revelation 14. I'd like to read verse 12 to you. Revelation 14. It says here, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." These are the people that are the opposite of cowards. These are the people that, as God said to Joshua, be of good courage. Be strong in the faith. Stand. Don't worry. Don't be anxious. Don't let your heart be troubled. And trouble often comes when we turn our eyes away from the Lord and we look to man. So, another phrase for you to close. The rapture and the return of Christ will be all worth waiting for. The rapture and return of Christ will all be worth waiting for. In other words, all the agony that we'll go through now is worth it, knowing that the millennial kingdom is coming and that Jesus has a place for us. So don't be hurried in your spirit, is what I would say to you, for Jesus' return. Be patiently enduring. He is coming. There is something else I'd like to add to that, though. As well as our endurance, there's something that is required of us. And it's in Mathew 24, verse 14. And it says this, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Very often, I think, when we take hold of this verse, we tend to think that this just means, geographically, that the gospel will go to every nation, and that all the nations, and many of them, are all going to get saved. It's not what it's saying here. It says here, for a witness. The gospel is preached for a witness. It's preached for a witness unto the unsaved, and for those that won't get saved. Noah spoke the truth to the people of his time, but none of them were saved. His ark was a witness. It was a witness to God, a testimony of truth. And as we know what happened, everybody drowned. They had their witness. And so God will give us the strength and the power to endure, and whatever we have to face. And I mentioned earlier on about the pre-tribulation doctrine. That doesn't mean that because somebody believes that they're a coward. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying here is that those that propagate that doctrine, they set up a mindset in the hearts of people that they're not going to have to suffer those afflictions and death that Jesus talks about. They're going to get taken beforehand. Very much a Western tradition. And we forget, don't we, what's been happening right through the centuries. Our brothers and sisters martyred to death for Christ. It's happening right now in the world. We don't see it in the West, do we? We have our rather coddled lifestyles. Everything is fine over here for us. And so we can't imagine that happening. But a tsunami can come at any time, can't it? An earthquake can come at any time and destroy our lives. You often see it on the news, people lamenting the destruction of their houses, sometimes beautiful houses, everything that people have worked for all their lives to build up. You see, they've loved their lives, haven't they? They've loved their lives in the world. And the mindset that I believe the Lord wants us to have, no matter whether you believe the pre-trib, post-trib, whatever trib, the mindset should be that we must be prepared and ready to endure. Yes, wonderful if that doctrine is right and we all suddenly disappear. Yes, all of us would want that in our hearts. But the Lord is wanting to prepare us. He wants us to get ready. And I just want to leave you with that message this morning. And as I said at the beginning, if I'm not here some mornings, it doesn't mean I've gone completely. It might mean that the Lord has just said to me, come ye apart and rest a while. Remember, he did that too with the disciples. or like this one, it's a slightly longer study and it takes a little bit of time for me to prepare because I'm normally a short message giver. So I just pray today that your Sunday will be blessed with your families and friends, and I pray that those of you that are perhaps in a lonely situation, that the Lord will draw close to you, and that you'll be encouraged to open his word, and that his word will also be a comfort to you. And that also is the work of the Holy Spirit, isn't it? He comes alongside us to comfort us and to stand with us, and he will always be there, even to the end of the age. Have a blessed day.